Destiny's Lab, a Zulu Kane. You listen to what they say, cause you wanna have a way to escape. You wanna be in control of your fate. Just another one gone oblivious. You remain oblivious to all the consequences and all the obvious problems here. Look at you fooling around with that mythicism and philosophy's hypocrisy has messed up your vision. Now blindly you see no problems with Buddhism and Hinduism. You think every God's inside. I hope that you listen now. The Bible says the spiritual guides are just demons. Look at Acts 16:16 and get reading. You'll see the fortune teller and the demons embedded deep within the body. She could do mysterious things. I'ma tell you this, hopefully it's not too confusing. It's not some kind of enlightenment. It's definitely not improvement. It was only the demons inside doing those amazing things. Just look at Revelation 16:14. Working these miracles ain't hard for demons to do. They even got yoga instructions and manifesting miracles. But they keep on deceiving, saying there's not a lot of parts of the Bible you should believe in. You listen to what they say, cause you wanna have a way to escape. You wanna be in control of your fate. Just another one gone oblivious.
Why do you turn to spirits that peep and mutter, these wizards, the spirits of the dead?
These palm reading phonies are full of baloney. Consulting with psychics is just wasting money. There's obvious, scary, and serious side effects. Don't mess with mediums, don't be oblivious. Consequences could be tragic to mess with black magic and witchcraft. The fact is that Satan is crafty. He laughs at our tragedy. Sadly, the enemy's strategy actually feeds on our misery. Physically, mentally, spiritually, wearing us down till eventually you'll do most anything. Conjuring demons with Ouija boards. What you're exploring is horrible. Holding your soul, you're ignoring your conscience. How can you afford being lost in these perilous times without knowing that possibly you could be following forces of darkness and living oblivious?
You listen to what they say, cause you wanna have a way to escape. You wanna be in control of your fate. Just another one gone oblivious. You would think with all these prophecies coming to pass that a light bulb would light up over your head.
This new age lie is an ancient wolf in sheep's clothing, remolding itself with cults and mind probing, exposing itself, opposing, revolting, imposing its will on souls that he's holding, assaulting the mind and soul and controlling, preparing the blind. The times are unfolding, his followers frolic away false messiahs, believing in reincarnation and karma. This antichrist mimicker, copycat criminal, trickster of man, spewing words like a minister, sinister peacemaker, darkest of dictators, posed as a savior with goodwill behavior, later exposed as a liar and hater, invader of nature, the ultimate traitor, this arrogant jealousy, pride fornicator, who thinks he is greater than God the creator.
You listen to what they say, cause you wanna have a way to escape. You wanna be in control of your fate. Just another one gone oblivious.
Aunt Jane wasn't too bright when she was alive, but now that she's on the other side, she seems to be a fountainhead of wisdom. That doesn't make too much sense.
Because at the end it says Ginny was a fountain of wisdom, or she wasn't too bright when she was alive, but on the end it says Ginny was a fountain of wisdom, or she wasn't too bright when she was alive. She wasn't too bright when she was alive. I found it. Okay, I fixed it. It was coming from my phone. That is, okay, new stuff. Just to let you guys know, I have new stuff. I have a new computer. I have new software. And this is kind of the run through that every once in a while something other happens, and it connected my phone. It has connected my phone, and now I've had to mute my phone. Now the echo is gone. I think everything is. I've turned the volume back up even on my speaker. Looks like we're good to go. Anyway, I wanted to mention I love that song because it said at the end, some guy quoting about familiar spirits, he says, well, Jenny wasn't too bright while she was alive, but on the other side, she seems to be a fountain of knowledge. And I thought that was just kind of funny, because when people will, they'll try to get the dead summoned, they'll try to channel the dead, they get their loved ones, but they turn out to be really knowledgeable all of a sudden. But anyway, we're live with Gary Wayne and NPC. Gary Wayne, please say hello to everybody.
Well, hello everybody, and glad to be back, and hope everybody had a happy St. Patrick's Day, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that came about tonight, I think. And I think people will find that we've got some interesting little morsels to talk about.
Yes, and I'm glad you're back, and so is NPC. Say hi, NPC.
Shabbat shalom, folks. Thanks for being with us. I just hope those morsels are better than haggis.
And since it is Friday night, our normal night for me and NPC to go on, that's why he's been joining me with Gary Wayne, because Gary, just so you know, if you didn't realize already, NPC's a little bit smarter than I am.
Oh, cut it out.
So
Gary's smarter than me, so.
But Gary's smarter than all of us combined, so we'd love to have you on.
You guys are just setting me up, so I'm actually the dunce one here. So
that's right. You didn't write this massive, awesome book. That, in fact, just so you guys know, Gary has so much more than just this book that we have dropped the link for a couple of times, and you can also find in the description box. But he has done more than just his book. In fact, I was recently listening to you talk about, just to get a little off topic to start, it's okay, it's all related. But you were talking about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and I said, I need that information. I'm really excited to hear about it. I really knew you said that you had it, so I messaged you. I said, please email that to me, and you did. So if you guys ever want more information than just what's in the book, you can just message him on Facebook, Gary Wayne on Facebook, or you can go to the conspiracy, Genesis6conspiracy.com, and email him, and he'll give you extra documents on more than just what's written in the book. Isn't that right, Gary?
That's absolutely true, and I have a lot of documents. I don't have documents on everything under the sun yet, but I'm working on it. And so it goes into a lot more detail, and almost always, unless I'm specifically talking about occult things, it's going to be very much biblical driven. So when we're talking about Tolkien and Lewis, we're going to be talking mostly occult and where they got their allegories, their characters, their belief system, and how that interweaves into their stories and what their bloodlines were.
And speaking of bloodlines, my first, so my questions tend to come up as you talk, because that's just how it generally works. So whereas NPC is greater with his analytical brain, so together we're a force to be reckoned with, right? But my first question that I have thought of is, when it comes to some of this mythology of St. Patrick's Day, we could start with maybe who is St. Patrick, but I find the leprechaun really interesting. Is the leprechaun some kind of Nephilim bloodline, or are we looking at cryptids? What are we looking at here?
Well, they are very interesting little critters, let's put it that way. So they are part of the elementals, and the elementals breaks into 4 groups. 3 of them would be sort of in the fairy group, that 4th group that is kind of related but tends to be higher up in the hierarchy, so to speak. These are the trickster ones. These are have a trickster spirit to them, so they're mischievous. And there's many kinds of the mischievous types of little elementals, and like the Menuhe in Hawaii would probably be in that mixture. And so they're not Nephilim, but with the little people, with the elementals, and I think we talked on one show a lot about fairies one time. And if it didn't, I'm confusing the shows, but the fairies are a Nephilim kind of creation. They're kind of in that sort of group. And they're either created through some DNA manipulation or, again, using some sort of sexual copulation to do it, because out of mythology we tend to get a little bit of both, but heavily weighted to some sort of sexual copulation. So, and each of the little people have their own specific sort of agendas. And so the leprechauns are very much shrouded in sort of allegories and sort of mysteries, and they're known as abductors, as most of the tricksters are. They're also ones that have a relationship to the rainbow and the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and the 3 wishes, if you catch one, to let them loose. So again, that has that sort of connection to satanic mythology, where you get 3 wishes if you can fool the devil somehow. And so they are very, very much distinct. And I think that gold at the end of the rainbow tends to be an allegory for knowledge that they have access to. So they're kind of akin to the gnomes who looked after the genealogies and the knowledge and the technology for the hierarchy, including the Nephilim and the fallen angels. And so that's kind of how I would sort of portray them. And you'll find this interesting because we did St. Valentine's Day show not that long ago. There's a lot of information out there now that suggests that sort of the origin and its etymology comes out of the festival of Lupercalia, and that if you look at that word leprechaun, you've got that actually in it. It's just there's a translation in there, and that was, of course, those weird festivals that went on at Palatine Hill, and we covered that. If anybody wants to go back and listen to the Valentine show, we covered that off in detail, so I won't cover that all off. And I don't know exactly what the connections are, but that's also the part of the Etruscan mythology and gods, in the god of Diana, which is the god of the fairies, right? And also thought to be that in one of the streams in terms of the Tuatha de Danann of Ireland, the Irish Nephilim and Rephaim after the flood. Danu is thought to be either Danu of Scythia and Sumeria, but also Diane as the female goddess as well. So, and she's kind of like the goddess of the Tuatha de Danann, just as the tribe of Danu. So there's a connection there back to the Etruscan pantheon through Diane, where that's where she was located in terms of her, Roman and Etruscan home and pantheon. And there's also some interesting wordplay, and there's another etymology that goes back that I think might be sort of a dual meaning to this, and it is leprechaun. Leprechaun is broken down into lucor and pan in its original form in this other version, and that means either small body, which I don't buy, or small god, as in the Pan god and Peter Pan. And that the Pan god was a nature god, which is so are the leprechauns. And so that's why you have Peter Pan dressed in green. That's why you have the leprechauns dressed in green. And this all sort of roots into the May festivals and things like that. And so you have what's also intermixed with the leprechauns would be the 4-leaf clover, or the 3-leaf clover, that's celebrated on St. Patrick's Day, and with leprechauns kind of mixed in with that iconology. And that tends to be more of a say last 400 or 500 years where the leprechaun comes in, but it's sort of centric to that mythical Irish lore. And so the three the three pieces of the clover has, significant mystical sort of connections, and it's sacred, as I said. So it's the green snake goddess that it's sacred to, which again sort of connects back into St. Patrick a little bit. And that you have with this green goddess, and it's also called the green one, some people call her Cora. The leprechauns play a unique role with this nature goddess, and I haven't really been able to dig into the bottom as to what that sort of connection is, but understand that the three-leaf clover is also overlaid onto St. Patrick's Day, right? And the mythology about that is that that's how St. Patrick explained the Trinity to the polytheist Irish people who were, ministered to by the Druids as the priests. So, and that he kind of explained it as connecting with a branch, right? As Jesus is called the branch, then the word would be a branch, and it would come from the Father. And that's sort of the mythology in terms of why that gets adopted also into St. Patrick's Day. But that's sort of a brief sort of understanding of the leprechaun. Oh, and the other thing that's important, because it's related to the leprechaun significantly, it also represents the three wishes the leprechaun can provide if you capture them.
Okay, so you mentioned the serpent, and one of the original stories, and sorry, NPC, if I'm taking away one of your questions with this, but NPC talks about this with me sometimes, that St. Patrick pushed out or got rid of the serpents of Ireland, and there really isn't like a serpent that's native to Ireland. So do you think this was a spiritual thing with St. Patrick?
Yeah, I think that's the essence of the story of St. Patrick, is that there's an allegory that's been sort of overlaid into the mythology. And so he was the one who evangelizes Ireland. And before we're done with St. Patrick, not right now, I'm going to get to the question, but we need to talk a little bit more about who he actually was, in terms of perhaps how he's portrayed as a saint, because that has some interesting details that sort of leads into a whole bunch of different other things. But in the meantime, he went over there to evangelize. And so Ireland, although they didn't have snakes and don't have history of snakes, they have a strong history, as do the Druids, of a history with serpents and serpent gods. So you have like Nodred, which is the old Gaelic serpent god, and you have Nathair, which is Irish for a serpent god, and Dreg is the Celtic dragon god, the gliding god, and I'll also mention Cora. So there's a strong understanding there between snakes and Irish history, but more to do with the gods and with the priests. So in the Celtic and Irish understanding of their religion is a serpent is equal to wisdom, and that the serpents are all-knowing. And so those people like the Druids, who are called learned and or knowing men, are called serpents. And the Gaelic word for, or it should be more accurately Irish, although Gaelic and Irish are closely related, Gnadar, Gnadr, is the root word for adder, which is also, we see that show up in the Bible with the seraphim and the serpents, particularly in verses like Isaiah 14:25, as I recall. But it's not 25, it would be 28 or 29, but it's got to do with the serpent's root. And the adder, of course, is a species of a snake, and is closely associated with the cult as the cobra is. And in again in Irish, it derives a word called Gnadir, so Gnadir, and that's from the Gaelic Nadrad, and it means serpent priest. And what I always find interesting is how some of the other organizations that people don't necessarily connect together, how they talk about the same topic. So in this case, let's look at the Gnostics and the secret societies, and one very, very famous person is Manly P. Hall. And what he wrote about St. Patrick is that he said the Druid priests of Britain and Gaul call themselves serpents, and these two are snakes that St. Patrick is said to have driven out of Ireland. And so when we start to dig into the Druidic and Irish religion, it was serpent worship, and they called it this is a tough one for me to always say, ophiolatry. So if you can understand the word ophites, which were sort of the original Greek serpent gods, that's the same sort of name that Gnosticism is overlaying onto the Druidic and Celtic language. So Ophi of the Ophites, just as you had Ophites as a Gnostic group and religion, in the time of Jesus, and for a few hundred years after that. So they very much celebrated the serpent, and they had sort of three pillars to their religion in terms of the three cornerstones, which would, I guess, also be representative as well with the three-leaf clover that's sacred. And that was the sun, the phallus, and the serpent, are the three pillars of the Druidic religion. And so not only did they worship a solar deity and a serpent, but they also connected and overlaid these into a sun-worshipping cult, which is the same cult that I always talk about that was before the flood and all around the world after the flood. In this case, we don't get much with the bull, but you do get all of the other aspects. And I'm sure if I were to dig deeper, you could find a little bit more about the bull cult in there as well as you go back into the antediluvian epoch. And the serpent god, in some cases, was called the dragon ruler of the world. And his chariot was drawn by serpents. And his priests, in sort of the general customs, served the Ophite god, as they're called in Gnosticism, and talking about Druidism, and were called adders after them. And that's where that word adder connects back into Gnadir that I talked about earlier. And there's an interesting poem that was done in the 6th century by a Druid bard, and I'll just use the quote on it. And the bard's name was Taliesin, and he said, "I am a Druid, I am an architect," which has overtones to the great architect of the universe. "I am a prophet, and I am a serpent." And if that doesn't say sort of everything about what St. Patrick was actually driving out and taking on, at least according to the mythology of what he did, that's what he was driving out, was that serpentine religion out of Ireland.
Okay, we have a question from the chat, and that question comes from April, and she says, is this related to the Great Hunt, like Diana, related to Diana the Huntress, where she says she's seen stories related to her in the Great Hunt that might pertain to human sacrifices? Because you mentioned Diana.
Yeah, it's because Diana is closely associated with being the female goddess of the Tuatha de Danann, who are the fairy people. The Great Hunt would be exactly that, and it would be a hunt not only for animals but for humans. And we talked about that, I think, on the Christmas show, that would be the similar sort of 12 days of Christmas of the Odin hunt, right? Because it's all the same religion. They just have different names for the festivals and the things that they did. So where this kind of connects back is through the Tuatha de Danann, who are the fairy people, the fairy folk, and the shining ones, who are the giants of Ireland. And they were created both before and after the flood, seemingly, or they migrated out of Scythia is another version, and a few other groups intermingling them, as Labar Gabala talks about, several different waves of giants and other peoples intermixing. They were originally created before the flood as a Nephilim, as an offspring of the fairies. And the fairies were these godlike angels, and led by the proud fairy, or the proud angel, that came from another planet. And then their bodiless spirits are the banshees, or the demon spirits that roam about. And there's a few different words that they use in the Irish mythology for the spirit. And then, of course, you have the fourth group, which is those elementals, which were created by these fairy gods as well, and probably similar to how the Tuatha de Danann were created. And that's why I say that they're very much part, when we talk about the leprechauns, are part of that elemental group, and you see how that sort of connects back. So if we understand that all of these belief systems go back to a core religion and a core history, we don't have to worry about the different names. We just know that they're talking about that same religion of the rebellious angels.
I have another question from the chat from What the Heck, that's his name on YouTube. He says, is there meaning to the color green? And I would bet there is, and I bet you know a lot about that, so please enlighten us.
Well, the green in this case has got a lot to do with being the nature gods that I had alluded to, with the Pan god and the May festivals and the spring festivals. And so this whole ideology with the little people and the fairies and the gods and the Pan gods, they are all nature driven. And that's the movement that we see in the green movement today, is that nature environmentalist group that is ruled by these spiritual demons and fallen angels. So green, yes, in this case is not necessarily related to the color of green as it would mean, let's say, in the secret societies, but would be connected in through another allegory. But green in this case is always about those spring, May sexual festivals. And so you can see that sort of overlay in some other fairy tales and tales, like you would have Robin Hood of Sherwood Forest and all the green, and how Robin Hood is always dressed in that green sort of aspect. So when you see that green color in connection with rebellion and or religion, you know they're talking about this nature cult, so to speak, of this religion. But it has to do with specific gods within the pantheon as opposed to the overall religion. So it's almost like a sect of it.
Okay, so I am going to tell people and remind them, if you are in the chat, you're welcome to ask as many questions as I can write down fast enough. So if you have more questions, feel free to ask them. And I know NPC has come up with some notes and questions, so I'm going to let you ask some. And then, of course, I might think of something and not interrupt. I'll let you all finish, of course. But I might want to chime in with some of that as you're going, NPC. So I want to hear what you were thinking.
Hey, thanks. Well, I would like to comment on that green thing, because I had just discovered something that I thought was very interesting. So the date for this holiday is always the 17th, correct?
Yes, every year.
Yep.
Okay, so it had never really dawned on me before, because we've been studying the feast days there, and so what I've learned is, and as I was becoming familiar with these, I was getting confused, always seeing two references to New Year's. And so it took me time until we had been doing it for a full year, or not, actually, it's not been a full year yet, but we had to get through many seasons before I understood that there was a civil calendar that is the 7th month, and that is in September, Sept meaning 7, and that Nisan is the 1st month of the ecclesiastical year. So there are actually two New Years in the same Hebrew calendar year. So you have 1 and then 7. Well, Aries or Nisan is associated with red, and then you got September is green. So I think the leprechaun being like typically redheaded with green attire is kind of a reference to this. Well, and they're little too. So maybe like some type of alchemical homunculi, type deal. Because the Tuatha would, of course, have known about these things too, having been, originally servants from Yahweh. I think that they were maybe importing these things, or so I don't know. I was just throwing it out there that I think that 17 is very interesting to me because it's the 1st and 7th month, and so I don't know. You got anything to add about that, Gary? Because it just kind of blew my mind when I discovered that. 17 has some other weird properties. Of course, it's prime and all that jazz too.
Yeah, prime number is a key part of that. So it's a key number, and they like to be able to add and interchange the numbers as they, make very, very complicated allegories that are rooted in their sacred numerology and stuff like that. So you have to understand that there is solar calendar and there is a lunar calendar. And so typically the Hebrew is based on the lunar calendar that was replaced for the solar calendar, which is part of the solar sun worshipping cult that we talked about. But they also recognize the lunar calendar because the goddesses are the moon gods, and you have a whole bunch of other occultic things related with the cycles of the moon. So they recognize both, but they on the polytheist side clock dates and things and years by the solar calendar. So they consider that a little bit more superior. But green is something that's also interesting because you have the green eyes of the Tuatha de Danann, although there's blue eyes as well. They're typically more green eyes, right? You've also got the Green Knight as an allegory that's in the King Arthur tales. You have the green language, which is the allegorical language, the legomenism that they like to use. That's their favorite in-house term would be for green. So green overlays onto a lot of things. And if you go to the Sarmatian people, which are connected with the Tuatha de Danann, because they're part of the Scythians, and the Scythians, who are the Tuatha de Danann that show up after the flood, they wore green scales in terms of their armor, so that they would look like serpents, and they were known as the Serpent people. So that's that green snake ideology that also rings back in and out through particularly Irish mythology and any of the serpentine kings and dynasties. So if you go to King James, the king that sponsored the King James Bible, he's of the unicorn dynasty, which is not a unicorn that they represent it as, and that's not a word that comes out of Hebrew. It's actually a wild bull, and he's got a unicorn in his dynasty, but they call themselves, with their colors, the green and gold dynasty, which is reflective of this whole sort of lineage and ideology, because that dynasty, has heavily influenced not only the Picts, which are also a division of the Tuatha de Danann, but you also have the Celtic kingships of King Arthur that marry in it, but also the kings of Dalriada that come out of the Tuatha de Danann, that migrate, that is all going to form into the Bruce dynasty, which spawns through King James Stuart dynasty. And Stuart means cupbearer, which is usually a gold cup for their god, and it's a sort of a royal sort of title. So anyways, I know I'm throwing out lots of little details there, but I just wanted to sort of connect some more dots in there on the green thing. It's a very, very important word in color in the occult, and and that's why they also love the evergreen tree, right? And it's also a sign of their immortality.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting because Hillary Clinton calls herself Evergreen.
That's her Secret Service code name, yeah.
Okay, back to you, NPC. Yeah,
and isn't that
right.
just perfect, though, isn't it? Secret.
Secret.
Secret allegorical code word in by somebody who's of the occult. I mean, it's just absolutely perfect.
Well, and pine tree's fruit is a pine cone, of course, and I think that could be a reference to the pineal gland, which is, the giants and those bloodlines were known for preying upon humans. Even the Tuatha de Danann were known for their giant slaying, even though they had fallen, correct? Because they would roughly translates to the tribe of Dan. So they were the northern tribe that fell, but then migrated. So is this kind of related to like when Jeremiah took Tamar, the Egyptian princess? Was that a different kind of departure then from like the Tuatha? Was that some... I mean, you know a lot about that, so I was wanting to ask about that. Are you there?
You're still
You guys hear
muted,
me?
Gary.
Oh,
You want to be careful of overlaying the tribe of Dan onto here. It is true that Tamar, at the Babylonian invasion and exile of Judah, Tamar and a few others escaped to Ireland and intermarried into the bloodlines. But that's not where the Dan overlay comes from, and she's not from the tribe of Dan. She's from the tribe of Judah. So this is not the tribe of Dan that a lot of people think it is. It's the tribe of Danu. Anu as in the Sumerian god, and Danann as in Diane. It's the two overlays on that. So I know there's a lot of people out there that like to look at it, but the evidence just doesn't seem to sort of stack up. You get a little bit better evidence for the name of Dan, even though you have to be careful again of confusing the Tuatha de Danann as you sort of move up the Danube River as to where that comes from. And the Danube River is one of the holy rivers of the Tuatha de Danann. But you get an overlay of and more of a conflation there of the two than you do over in Ireland. But when you talk about the Tuatha de Danann, these were giants. These were people that took over the island from other giants like the Fomorians, and they were a little bit more ogre-like. And so the Tuatha de Danann are the people of the Sidhe, Sidhe, and people want to Google Riders of the Sidhe. It's a very, very famous painting, and they're riding these white stallions with these helmets of a single horn on it, which is, so these are post-diluvian Sidhe as opposed to the antediluvian Sidhe before the flood, where they actually rode a real unicorn, which was a giant horse-like being with other animal parts in it. And the size of the horn was so big it could gore an elephant and dissect it completely with one blow. And it was the horse that the Nephilim kings rode into battle on. So the Riders of the Sidhe is showing that as a helmet, but it's sort of a dual allegory of after the flood, but people watching, you're looking at it and who know in terms of being into the mysteries know that it's also referring to the antediluvian unicorn horse. And they're wearing crowns of snakes, because again, snakes are very, very important to the Tuatha de Danann as well. And they were called the ancient race. The snake symbol of the wisdom that they received from their gods is that snake imagery. But they would have looked like snakes. And they were also shining ones, just as the serpent beings were shining ones in Mesopotamia as well, and their eyes would glow, and they could literally light up a whole room with the glow of those eyes. So there's a definite connection there where you have the giants, but they're intermarrying, as I said, with different waves. So you've got like Skoda, who is also mixed into the waves, and in mythology they're also said to be a tribe of Israel as well, but they're really not. Scota's the daughter, and there's two Scotas in history, and they both migrate to Spain, and they both migrate to Ireland. I covered off the differences of that in the book, but the point of the matter is they come out of the Armana dynasty, the first ones, and who end up migrating and are the parent name, sort of the patronymic name or the eponymous name for the Scottish people that comes across with the Dalriada shift of kings from Tara over to Scotland, which is going to bring about that Stuart dynasty that I was talking about. So there's that connection of other peoples, but when you look at the Armana dynasty, that's who Akhenaten comes out of, who looks like a serpent again, right? When you look at his statue, and this is the daughter of Akhenaten. So again, you get that snake thing that is just overflowing with all of the imagery of Ireland. And so when you have St. Patrick driving out all of the snakes, he's driving under this snake-driven polytheist religion, and he's also said to have gone and shut down many of the portals that were in the lakes. And so when you see the ladies of the lake as fairies in King Arthur, they're guarding the portals, because many of the portals in the occult is beneath water. And he's said through the mythology has gone to these portals where these beings would come through from the other world to have closed those portals down through some sort of exorcism ritual. And so that's part of how he drove out that influence of these gods and little people, overwhelming influence over Ireland, because there it seems that they had the most influence of anywhere in the world.
We have another question from the audience, and it is from the Bubba News, and he says, and you may have kind of just mentioned something about this coming through from another realm, but this is a bit more specific. Do you think the giants will be released during the tribulation, and where will they come from? Antarctica, Scotland, Mount Hermon, etc.? Question.
Well, I think we could see things coming at us from a lot of directions. So if there's we would call it the netherworld or the underworld or the other world, or Anwin as it's called in the Arthur tales, if they had the ability to have a place in another dimension that's usually located in the earth, then there's a possibility that they've kept some of these giants for the end time, so that when we hear, let's say, an interview that Steve Quayle did with this red-haired, green-eyed giant in Afghanistan, as he was interviewing some of the people that were involved on it, that giant was located, in the mountains and where there was lots of caves, and caves tend to be another place of portals. So one wonders whether or not they're able to come through and through some of those portals. I also think that we have to be aware of that there's going to be a possible recreation of giants. We can never take that off the table. And so I would expect that if we're going to have giant or angels that are not in the abyss and weren't put in the abyss, that are rebellious, as we get closer to the end time, that they may actually procreate other ones because they know their time is very short anyways, and that the abyss is going to be opened up. You also have the ability for maybe some of these giants that are off the earth, but again, that would be like in a portal, I suppose, is kind of the same kind of ideology. And you also have in Revelation 9, just before the midpoint, and certainly a little bit after the start of the last 7 years, you have an opening of the abyss. And in Ezekiel 32, we're told about these ancient antediluvian and post-diluvian kings who were slain, the terrors of the earth, the ones who caused terror in the land of the living against the humans that were locked up into cells along the sides of the abyss. they're going to be released, as well as the ones who created giants both before and after the flood. If there was a second incursion, and I think there was, they're going to be released. And of course, those are already have an MO of creating these giants. So I think there's a good possibility that we're going to see these giants show up somehow, some way, so that it will be like the days of Noah. So yes, simple answer is, but what I can't tell you is from which sort of angle they're going to come from, or maybe from all angles.
NPC, I'm going to go back to you because I know you've made lots of notes, and I don't have another question from the chat yet that I've seen. So back to you, my friend.
It's cool. Hey, thanks for clearing that up too, because I'd seen how it translated to tribe of Dan, and but I was unaware of the Danu Sumerian god altogether. So I didn't realize that they actually hailed from Mesopotamian area. So like
how the history goes is they escape. This is their history, is that they escaped from the abyss, or Tartarus, which is probably a counterfeit abyss, after the flood, and into Scythia, and they migrated down into, and of course they would be antediluvian then, and that they migrated into Sumeria after the flood, and then into the Middle East and intermixed with other giants there. And also they migrated north into Romania and the Transylvania area, which is why you have Dracula. That's an allegory for a Tuatha de Danann, who's very pale skinned, hazel eyes, red hair, educated at the School of Solomon in Vienna, and blood drinker and everything. But I'm getting sidetracked. And up north, they migrated into Germany and into Norway and Sweden and into Russia and into the Ukraine, and started the kingships there. And that's where the blue-eyed, blonde-haired ones tend to, in their more pure form, come from. So you have this strong tradition, and these are the ones that, if people are following, all the buzz that's been out there the last few years for Tartaria, that's the same route to this Tartarian empire that moved eastward, and it's the same people.
Isn't there a Tartar connection to Ireland? Because there's like a Tartar blue, right?
Yes, there is, and tartans are very, very popular in Scotland and Ireland, and that's part of the makeup of the kilt. And that this tartan is you even have the word tartan that shows up in the Bible that describes Sargon, who is the sort of bringer of the first apocalypse to Israel, and captures Israel and takes them off to Assyria and destructs Tyre and places like that. And he's actually called Tartan, which means a military leader of some sort. So it's these warrior aspect of the Tartar and the Tartan, and all of that is connected back to Tartarus as you take that etymology through. And so if you follow those kind of words, you can make those connections, and you'll start looking for other connections that you'll see that they're talking about the same kinds of people, whether it's the Sarmatians, which are the dragon people, Scythians, which were serpent type people, the Amazons were all part of that as well, and it crosses many cultures.
So what we see is just innocent plaid and animals, like on these crests and stuff. Really, they're all telling a story about their respective bloodlines in this age-old battle that's been raging on for eons, huh?
Yes, everything that they display like that has this sort of transgenerational, transmillennia heritage to it, is taciturn language of their genealogies and their history.
I'm looking at a long list here of all these different clans, and they all have different patterns and colors. It's really quite remarkable. I've never looked into it until just now. Thanks for bringing that up. So that was Tartan, huh? And so I wanted to ask about the Blarney Stone or the Stone of Scone. Are those things associated with Ireland also?
Well, the Blarney Stone, I haven't really dug a whole lot into. It's certainly part of its mythology, but I never found anything that I thought would be super important that we should know about that, but I might be wrong on that. But there are a couple other stones. There's the Stone of Destiny and the Bethel Stone. And so the Bethel Stone comes over with Tamar, who we talked about earlier. And you have the Stone of Destiny, which is the Akhenaten stone. I think it's more of a blackish, probably meteor type of stone that was under the Pharaoh's throne that came with Skoda. And so these are the two famous stones that the Doleriotic kings take over to Scotland, and one remains in Scotland today, and one sits under the throne of England. So, and again, those are sort of outside the traditional Tuatha de Danann. They're inserted at a later date. But when you get into things like Excalibur and things like that, that's all Sarmatian and Scythian history that's been kept alive in not only King Arthur but also in Tuatha de Danann mythology. And if people wonder why I keep referring to King Arthur, it's because he was a pendragon of the Tuatha de Danann. And so he is a fairy king and a dragon king as a pendragon, and you get that overlay. And the Guinevere is the fairy queen or the owl queen, and her name, I won't go into the minutiae of the details of this. I have a lot of it in my book, but her name goes back to the Tuatha de Danann as well. And so they're representatives of the divine bloodlines on Earth, who have this round table, which is the Lord of the Rings or the Ring Lords of Sumeria. It's the same setup, and all of those knights around the table aren't just knights, they're kings, like Gawain is from Lot, Norway, of the bloodline of Rollo and the Vikings. And of course, Rollo is the family that invades Normandy in 912 AD, as I recall, and they changed their name to the St. Clairs, which is a name of one of the battle partners to Henry de Payon and the founding of the Knights Templar, and the transliteration into Scotland to the St. Clairs, who are the most powerful family in Scotland, who recreate Freemasonry and are the biggest supporters for the Bruces and putting the Stuarts up on this long chain of a dynasty. So everything just always connects once you start to understand the imagery.
It's definitely all connected. I'm sorry to interrupt you, NPC, for just a second, because I did have two questions. Sherry asked, this is a little bit off of, so just you go back to your topic, NPC, even though it's a little off, but it's kind of all related, as we say. But Sherry asked, are there writings from all the time since Jesus through the centuries to prove how much time has really passed? And I think it's a good question, because we were talking about Tartaria, and we'll have another question a little bit about mud floods. And it is there. I've seen maps and things that look like they're writing I1, like instead the one and the I are different. So instead of being like 1,163, it might have been I163. What do you? And she was kind of think that's what she's kind of asking on is there any way to know how much time has actually passed? Has it been as many centuries as we think, or has it been less?
Well, I think my position is from a literal perspective from the Bible. So I think we get the years that come down from the time of Adam, and that's about 6,000 years. So I don't think that there's that mysticism that's in the Bible that would have those in as allegories. And I know that wasn't the question. I just want to let people know how I come at Scripture and how I understand Scripture. So that doesn't mean that the Earth isn't a lot older. I mean, I'm just saying from the time of Adam to now, it's about 6,000
Exactly.
years. So you've got, an allegory that's in Second Peter that, a day is like 1,000 years, and that's an allegory. I mean, we don't know how long a day is actually for God. Is it more? It's hard to say, but at a minimum, if that's the case, then from the start of creation, with the renewal, and I fall not doctrinal, but I fall leaning a lot more towards a older Earth, that the renewal of the Earth that happens in Genesis 1:2, you've got 6 days, that's 6,000 years of development. And then you have the Sabbath, and then sometime later, some people say the 8th, but we're not given that for exact information. There's some periods in there. But I also look at that you can translate Genesis 1, that the world became formless and void, and that it matches up very well with Psalms 104:30, where you have a renewal of the earth when God sends his spirit. And so we have no idea how old the earth actually is, if that's the case, because something caused the earth to be destroyed to the foundations. You can't destroy the foundations because they're forever, but the earth was renewed. But when you destroyed that earth by fire, as Second Peter talks about, that caused the earth to collapse on itself. Although what they're talking about is the water that the earth was in and was out of in Second Peter. That's the water that is separated in the renewal of the earth to create the firmament and create life. So that's what had collapsed down on the first creation. And if people are wondering, well, how does Exodus 20 fit into that? Well, it's when it talks about the heavens and the earth were created, that fits perfectly, because there's 3 different heavens. And you've got the third heaven where God lives, you've got the heavens that are outside the firmament, and then you've got the dome of the firmament. And so you've got those 3 heavens. And heaven is defined in Genesis 1 as the firmament. And all the lights that went in it, that's all inside the firmament. So I think that matches up very, very well. I won't spend 2.5 hours on a presentation on how that can be translated like I did at the True Legends video conference last spring. But I think that fits very, very well with a much older Earth that, fits better with, let's say, the angelic rebellion and the possibility of dinosaurs. Again, I'm not doctrinal on that, but for me it fits better. But I think the Earth, I think just trying to take the age of the Earth back to the time of Adam and saying that's only how old it is very kind of narrow-minded in terms of, not in a derogatory way, but narrowly focused sort of way as to all the other details that are around it. And we're not told anywhere that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. We just have those genealogies back to Adam that says that.
Okay, and let me ask the other question while I have you, and then I'm going to let NPC go back on the track he was on.
Fine.
And I know you don't mind, and I appreciate that. Thank you guys you're both very patient and awesome people. So Edme asks, you mentioned the giants of Tartarus. Is that the connection we have with Tartarian mud floods and remnants of the giants into the early 1900s? And you said that people are kind of talking about this Tartarian discussion coming up again, and the mud floods are a big one, and people are saying we might have had another situation like Atlantis as recently as in the last 200 years. So anyway, if you want to answer that.
Well, I don't know about a mud flood that was wiping out, half the world in the last couple hundred years. But what I do know is you have a lot of these kingships and civilizations that are started by the Aryans, which are part of this Tuatha de Danann, the Marianu as they're called. And they're all part of the same people that come out of the Tartarus at the same time. They may be a different kind of Nephilim. A lot of people will take the Aryans, even though they're blonde hair and blue eyed, to a connection to the lion type of offspring as you get into Persia and places like that. But these are the same people that are starting the civilizations, both the Tartarians and Scythians is probably a better way of calling them, and the Aryans that start in the subcontinent of India, and that continues to migrate through. And so you get the king of the Mongolians, the Genghis Khan dynasty. They're very clearly portraying their genealogy and history as being Scythian. And so I think it's, we don't get enough history that comes out of that part of the world, but what we do get seems to show a direct connection to all of that.
All right, thank you. And so back to you, Mr. NPC 314.
Yeah. So I was reading here about St. George and the Dragon, and I was just kind of wondering, do you know much about that story? Because it kind of sounded like it related pretty heavily to this holiday we were talking about.
Yeah, I think it's interconnected in there. It sort of comes at it from a little bit different angle. I'm not a real expert on St. George and the Dragon, but he is doing the same kind of thing, right? He is, attacking these godlike creatures that are allegorized to a physical dragon as opposed to, possibly Nephilim type of people or the gods. And we talk about these gods as being serpents and dragons, and I probably should have got this on the table, very early on in the show. I mean, we're talking about seraphim angels, right? We're talking about dragon angels. We're talking about angels with serpent faces and feathers, right? So when you hear cultures talking about these serpent gods or these dragon gods, and in this case the Tuatha de Danann and the Irish gods that are serpents, these are the seraphim angels, and they're known in other cultures, like India as the Nagas, and in South America and Central America as the plumed serpent and the feathered serpent. And these were serpent gods, but dragon serpent gods, right? So when George is slaying these dragons, then that's more, to me, it's got two different divisions in the story. It's got one that seems to be more recent history and one that seems to be based on older history, right? And it seems to also have a connection back to Scythian and Sarmatian mythology. So, but at the end of the day, it's driving at the same sort of thing, that they're driving out the Celtic religion, and that seems to be what's going on there, as opposed to actually fighting literal dragons. I know a lot of people think that there were actually literal dragons, and maybe there were, but it doesn't seem to be the case, because all of the dragons that are portrayed as these flying dragons in stories and mythology and writings, out of the medieval ages, are flying dragons, right? Fire-breathing dragons. And those would have had their wings taken away and their feet taken away with the Nakash, unless somehow the Nakash, there were some survivors that were taken to the underworld and they escaped, because there would have been several different kinds of the Nakash species, or the Hesh, as it's probably more accurately pronounced, but pronouncing it as it's spelled, Nakash. So
I've seen it that way.
Yeah, so I think that's what's really kind of going on there. Is it, again, it's kind of the same mythology, but it is, what's the best way of putting it? I think again, if I go back to the King Arthur tales,
it's like a parallelism.
Yeah, so Merlin is talking, and Merlin is a druid wizard, right? He's a druid priest, and a Merlin is a title for a type of priest, and so he's a caricature of the priesthood. And he is saying in the King Arthur tales and a lot of the original writings, and towards the end, is that this is no longer the time of the druidic religion, and it has to go underground. and it's going to be the time of Christianity. If you look at that timing of the King Arthur tales and Merlin, that's in around the 400s, right? 4 to 600s. And that's the same time as St. Patrick, and in the same era St. George. And I think they're all talking about the same thing. And so when I talked about St. Patrick was closing off the portals, I think that's part of that mythology overlay as well, to ensure the serpents weren't coming back.
That's really interesting. I was also reading something here that after they killed it, the dragon in the story, that the body was carted off in 4 ox carts. And I remember the reference to Leviathan you mentioned in Genesis, when the firmaments were being separated and stuff. It kind of references Leviathan as being like this great serpent that was slain, and it's just,
again, that's a standard piece of history in all the cultures and religions around the world. So all of them have a word for Leviathan, and of course there's a male and a female, and Isaiah talks about it in the end time the male's going to be killed, and it's God who 2 Leviathans. Behemoth is a different beast. And so you have in Sumeria, probably the best example is you have Tiamat, and also known as Yam and Lotan as you go around the Middle East. But it has a name in every culture. Virtu, I think, is the name, one of the names in the subcontinent of India. And so, but in the Middle East, you have Baal and Marduk as the main protagonists who are slaying that Leviathan creature, Tiamat, Lotan, Yam, and in this case, Korah for the Irish pantheon. And that is an equivalent goddess to Tiamat in their belief system. So again, you get these overlays that just sort of reinforces over and over and over. It's the same religion, it's the same history, they just have different names.
It's really remarkable. So they all have, yeah, you're right. They all have like the same story for the same thing, just much like the flood narrative is found a lot of times. So it must have been a real thing that had happened, and they all kind of explain it similarly. That's really remarkable.
Well, they have to explain it through a polytheist lens, right? And through a polytheist lens, they have to explain things like the flood. That's why the flood is on all cultures around the world and all religions around the world. And so you have those basic tenets that are always recorded, just through a monotheist lens, as in the Judaic-Christian perspective, or a polytheist version in the various versions around the world. And so, when you get like the days of creation, for example, and having the separations of the water above and the water below, that's in all the creations myths. And you have the drying of the land in all of those creation myths. And in the Norse one, that's called Middle Earth, that Tolkien is talking about. And that's one of the ways they're talking about the antediluvian period, let alone all of the creatures are sailing away on the ship at the end of Lord of the Rings, and they're saying this is the time of mankind, and they're on a boat on water, and that's an allegory, as he writes it, for the flood. So they all sort of disappear. They don't die, they go to somewhere else, right, through portals or whatever, which is why, again, in their belief system, we have to be prepared, if they believe that we're going to see giants and little people and things in the end time, because their belief system is that they're still around, and there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that they are. So we want to be prepared for that.
I had a note here about how Troy would name their warriors would call themselves Serpent Born. And I'd never heard that before, so I'd made a note about that. And then when you were talking about the Scythians and such, I'd heard this theory that maybe some of the sea peoples that had just, showed up and conquered all these places like Egypt could have possibly just been folks like Odysseus that were just trying to find their way back home.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and again, in the Welsh and the Irish history, you have waves of the people around Troy coming over there, just as you have them settling in France as well, which all produced the kingship bloodlines again. And that's why that serpent dragon imagery is so strong within the royal coat of arms and iconology. It's just naturally part of that.
So you also see horses a lot, and I never realized until very recently when I began studying the horse that it's actually one of the more divine animals, it seems. So amongst these boars and dragons and all these other things, there's always the horse, but it's so easy to overlook. Can you tell us maybe what the importance is of that? Because it's mentioned in Revelation too. Seems to be the judgment vehicle or something.
Well, horses are definitely important to royalty, and again, I think you get two different versions of that. You get the horses after the flood, and they're based on the unicorns before the flood. And typically, a unicorn was a white horse, right? And white horses are the most sort of royal of the horses. But the different kinds of the horse are used prophetically in the Bible, both in Zechariah with the chariots and in Revelation to represent certain things. But it's the white horse that is the conquering horse, right? So that imagery, again, overlaps. You just, again, have different perspectives on it. But if you understand that the white horse is telling us that this is going to be partly connected to the Rephaim kingdoms and the Nephilim kingdoms that are coming down through history, which are the beast kingdoms like Babylon and Syria and Egypt and Persia and Greece and Rome and the end time empire, and they're introduced with the conquering white horse, and it's going to become, and the eighth one is the Antichrist at the midpoint, right? So you've got 7 plus the 8th, and they come in on the white horse, which seems to be representative of those royal kings, those royal bloodlines, those, and as I say, before the flood, that would have been a white unicorn.
And so when you think about the family trees, you mentioned how these are branches, right? So we're waiting for the fullness of time, or the fruit of their loins, as it were. You mentioned it before as the dragon Messiah. So is that the one that comes from the stewards?
Well, they're going to present one option. There's going to be multiple antichrists, so it's going to get a bit confusing. And we're told in John and in Matthew and Mark that there's antichrist plural. So we should expect that. And that there's going to be rivals because you have these bloodlines all around the world. So not just in Europe. So you've got like the Mahdi out of the Shia in Islam, that's going to be an antichrist type figure. You've got Lord Maitreya, which is the new Buddha out of India. You're going to have a Chinese family antichrist figure, and on and on and on. So we're going to have lots of these. It's going to be confusing.
A Royal Rumble.
The Royal Rumble, just like World War I was a war of families, right? Of all Antichrist type figures, and but there can only be one. So there's going to be some settling out to happen. But there's going to be, like let's say you have several families that are interconnected in Europe that are part of the 13 families. And one of those families is the family that produced the Plantagenet kings that a lot of the presidents are linked to. So that family name is the Anjou. And that's got a couple different parts, the northern and the south family. But the Anjou were the ones who were crowned the kings of Jerusalem in 1118 in a small priory on the Rock of Zion in Jerusalem, where the term Priory of Sion comes from. And they're claiming through their Sionic of bloodlines the inheritance to the city of Jerusalem based on Joshua awarding Benjamin Jerusalem. So they've got not only Nephilim bloodlines that they take their bloodlines back, but they've grafted in the bloodlines of King Saul that I document in my book. I won't go into now, but it's in the book. And also they have Davidic bloodlines in. So they crown themselves the king of Jerusalem because that's what they want to be crowned with that title at the abomination. And the Anjou split into two bloodlines. So you've got those two competing bloodlines, and then you've got lots of other ones, like, as you say, the Stuart dynasty. You've also got the Windsors that will be wanting to claim that title as well. So you're going to have all sorts of families. And where the King of Jerusalem title is today is with the Bourbon family, which is King Philippe of Spain, son of Juan Carlos, who was also had the King of Jerusalem title that was inherited through intermarriage from the Habsburg Lorraine title. And the Lorraine family is the makeup and the bloodlines of the Anjou, de Bouillon, and de Payan bloodlines of the Lorraine region, who were three of the members of the founding Knights Templar that Henry de St. Clair of the Rollo clan was also part of. I'm sorry, you just keep going with these connections, right?
Yeah.
I just keep but just to show you that there's many, many bloodlines. And so when you see that movie, The Kingdom of Heaven, about the Jerusalem one, and they're talking about the players in there, that's part of that bloodline that I'm talking about. And that's the one that splits the Anjou family. But all of those people that are talked about in that movie, even though they're not shown to be these powerful Kingdom of Heaven,
The Kingdom of Heaven. I'm just going to type that in. Okay, go ahead.
I think Heath Ledger was in that one, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think so. And it's a very entertaining movie. And again, I've got sort of that genealogy and how that splits in those family lines. I did it in a 5-part series about Mount Hermon and how that all sort of interconnects. So if somebody wants to know the bloodlines about the Kingdom of Heaven and the Kings of Jerusalem, that started with Baldwin II, of the Anjou bloodline. In 1118, get a hold of me. I'll send you that document.
Okay, do you mind if I interrupt with a question from Jackie? I think she might have missed a few words, so if I get this wrong, Jackie, you can tell me. But it says, according to Psalm 82, it speaks about a congregation of Elohim that rule over the Gentile pagan nations after the Tower of Babel. And I think what she was saying is this what you speak of now when you talk about pagan gods?
Yeah. Let me explain that a little bit. So there is in Psalms 82 the Council of Gods, and that's both before and after the flood. So you have angels that are sent to the abyss before the flood, or I mean at the time of the flood, for the crimes they did before the flood, like creating the Nephilim and parading the world into destruction and teaching illicit knowledge. They went to the abyss, but not all fallen angels, just the worst and the impassioned ones. And then after the flood, you have gods like Baal and the Baalim and Amaru and all of the gods that are part of the Baalim, Astaroth, Astarte, and they kind of disappear too, because I think there's a second incursion, and so they go to the abyss. And then they're replaced by other angels. So it's just a succession that keeps going on, that steps up as the host of heaven is set up in ranks like an army, because it's defined as an army, the word host, as you take that back to Hebrew, and but angels move up to replace the ones that have been sent to the abyss, both before and after the flood. And that number is 70 nations, as it's counted in Deuteronomy 32 by the numbers of the sons of Adam and the numbers of the patriarchs in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles, and the sons of Israel or Jacob born in Egypt, which was also 70. So there's a consistency to that 70 nations, and it's not a translation mistake in terms of putting Israel in there. Israel is that's a compound word that's in there as it's used in its prehistorical sense, and it's a name that Jacob is given afterwards, which sort of blends that whole verse back together. Again, I have a document on the 70 Nations and Council that walks everybody through that if they want that. So yes, that is the gods that I'm talking about that still govern this earth, and Satan is at the head of that assembly because he's the god and the prince of this world. So underneath him is this council of gods, and this is a counterfeit of the assembly in heaven that God sits on. And that makes sense if you understand Isaiah 14, because Halel, Satan, wanted to have his kingdom to be, in his realm, to be like God, and to raise his throne to be into heaven to be like God. And so everything that Satan does, he counterfeits in heaven. So you would expect there would be that assembly at Mount Hermon. And that's exactly what they've done. So yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question. Bubba was asking about, is Tiamat, what is Tiamat? Is it the dark star, or is it something else? And I think you mentioned it as being one of the Leviathan. And so is there a Tiamat in the sky? Is that something, is there like a constellation, or what is that?
Well, there's a dragon constellation that would be based on those types of beings, absolutely. So Tiamat is a goddess, and she's at the source of the dragon kingships and the fairy bloodlines, just as that comes down through Lilith and down through all the other various individuals involved, and how it branches out across the world and into the kingships of the earth. Tiamat is part of the parent gods. And so Anu is sort of the chief god of the original parent gods. And so Tiamat also has a counterpart. All of the gods have a goddess or a wife in the parent gods, just as they do in the offspring gods. And according to the mythology of polytheism, there's a rebellion. So gods like Baal are offspring gods, Zeus and Osiris, Isis, and on, Inanna, just to stay with the same types of pantheons. And I think what happens there is they actually don't rebel and overthrow those parent gods. The parent gods are the ruling council before the flood. And because they're all lustful, morbid, impassioned gods, they're the ones in the abyss. And so if I go over to the Canaanite pantheon, it'll probably make some more sense. So El is the parent god. That would be equivalent to Kronos or to Anu in the Sumerian pantheon, Kronos being in the Greek pantheon. His son is Baal. So again, Baal overthrows El, but what's more likely is El just disappears and Baal takes over after the flood. Then Baal disappears because he creates Rephaim. So that makes sense as to why they don't show up, but other gods have stepped up in between. So Tiamat is one of the goddesses in the parent gods, just as you would have a counterpart in all of the parent gods. And then you would have similar names, not similar names, but similar gods that do similar things as what the parent gods that are in the offspring gods, because they take over. And that's what we see after the flood. So yes, she's a Leviathan dragon god, just as all of the, well, I shouldn't say all, most of the gods in the parent gods are all serpentine gods. There's a few other ones in there as well. And if you want to get a better depiction of it, go to the Ogdoad, Ogdoad gods of Egypt, which are the parent gods for Osiris and Isis. And you'll see images of these different kinds of serpentine gods, and some other ones like Anubis, which would be a jackal god. There'd be a lion god in there. So, and again, you'll have those types of gods show up again with the offspring gods as well. Hopefully I explained that. I know it's complicated.
Well, and I think you've talked about it before, so people can refer back to even previous ones that we've done. That Gary comes on about every 2 months, and so it wouldn't take long to kind of get back and feel, this is what I love, is I love hearing something about 3 to 7 times because it starts to click. So these are things we have talked about and can go over. And like he says, he has more information if you want to message him. There's the Genesis6conspiracy.com pinned at the top of the chat. It's also in the description box. I know very few people look at the description box, but there is one with information to find Gary Wayne on Facebook as well. So NBC, I want to get back to more notes or questions that you might have.
Okay. Jen Psaki inspired me to circle back here. So I wanted to ask about, we were talking about the stone earlier. You mentioned the Bethel stone. Could that also be the stone of Jacob, like the one that he laid his head upon and dreamed? And I was wondering if that had any connection to maybe when he was also wrestling with the angel. You mentioned how his name was changed. Sometimes in some of these myths, I noticed that there is always this stone that it seems to relate to kingship. Like with the Tuatha de Danann, there was a relic that was a stone that it sang when the true king would step upon it. Then we have the stone that Jacob dreamt on, and he's the king of his tribe. Then also with the stories of the Fomorians and the Tuatha, Lu, even though he normally wields a spear, he slays Balor with a sling and stone, just like David did with Goliath. So I was just wondering about this stone thing, and if maybe we could talk just a little bit more about the stone, if you knew anything. Because Peniel translates to place of encounter with angels. So it would just seem like there's some type of interface there with that, that thing that's the size of a grain of a mustard seed.
Yeah, so the Bethel stone is that stone that Jacob slept on, and everything to do with the ladder and everything else. And that's the stone that Tamar takes to Ireland.
Okay.
And that's exactly the stone that they're talking about. There's also in the Grail mythology the stone of heaven, and you've got stones of heaven that are part of worldwide cultures. Usually they're asteroid type of type of things that they collect, that they think have special powers. So so they're the stones that, and particularly the stone of Akhenaten, is where the English kings are sworn under, and as they were at Tara, and that's the stone that's under the Queen of England. So the other one's still in Scotland.
And so, speaking of rulerships and such, when we were talking earlier about the nations, somebody had a question about preventing the fullness of the Gentiles and what that phrase maybe meant. So if we think of this as like fruit and a war of the seeds, then are the thorns or tares trying to prevent the fullness of the Gentiles being the birth of that man-child with the rod that breaks apart their principalities and their nations, as it were? I mean, and then because that one stone then fills up the entire earth, right? So it's like they don't want to give up that the authority that they've been enjoying for so long, it would seem. Is that how it could be interpreted, perhaps?
Well, I think when we're talking about preventing, the fullness of the Gentiles, that's one of the goals that the polytheist forces have, that they want to rendezvous with destiny before the ordained time, because they want to limit how many people are going to be fulfilled, because everybody's name is written, and angels, I think included, are written in the book of life from before creation. And everybody has an opportunity to keep that name there or have it blotted out. Right? So I think what they don't want to do is allow more people to be saved, right? Because you have to be alive and making your free choices as to who you're going to choose, God or the way of the world. And they're trying to shorten that period of times. But try as they may, they can't bring about the end time until the restrainer is removed. So I think that's what they're talking about when they're trying to prevent the fulfillment of the time of the Gentiles. That's the fullness of the names that are in the book. So, and it seems to be, kind of naive on their part on that, not just from the omnipotent power of God, but if you think about it, is that even if they shortened the end time, which, or shorten the period to get to the end time, which I don't think they have the power to do, but let's say they could, the end time still happens the way God has foreseen it, and will ensure it happens. And then there's 1,000-year reign where even if those names didn't get a chance to come about, you could easily populate the earth enough to have all of those names still have a chance in the millennium. So,
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of like, what are you guys really trying to do with some of your allegories and agendas and plans like that? So, so did that sort of answer the question? Because you're also talking about other things about the stone, and I wasn't quite sure what you're getting at with that.
Well, yeah, because all the nations are kind of represented as trees, and so it kind of made sense to me that, like you were saying, during that millennial reign, those trees that were found fruitful will be left and not cut. In other words, they won't be blotted out, right? And then the others will be hewn, and their seed will not be preserved, right? So, I think that answers it pretty well.
Okay, that's good.
The stone, however, it seems to relate also to this coronation or kingship. So I was just curious as to how it kind of related, because the term I think often associated with that would be like some type of anointing, or like, doesn't the term Messiah mean anointed, for instance? So we kind of see these references to oil and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Messiah and anointed goes back to terms like Musagal and other words in Sumerian, very similar words, Meseha in Egypt, that are very, very similar as you get the Egyptian one to Moses. Some of the Muzhus is another one of the transliterations that means anointed, and Messiah. That's the dragon Messiah bloodline that I keep referring to.
Ah. Okay.
So yes, it definitely has those kinds of connections. And so the stone of destiny is the stone of where kings are being crowned upon, just as Akhenaten was, and the Armana dynasty, which is one of the most important dynasties in the polytheist belief system. And that's the stone that has traveled to Ireland and then to Scotland and then to England. And destiny is a choice, right? As opposed to a fate. And so the heroes in fairy culture, even though fairy comes from the word fate and phase, are the kings of destiny. Will they choose their destiny and fulfill their fate? Is basically how they would understand that. So these are the kings of destiny, which are the kings of the fae, kings of the fairy folk, the dragon kings and owl kings that are the kings of destiny. So they hold through their bloodlines, all of humankind's fate in their hands and their bloodlines.
Wow. Because it's part of their duty. Because they were sent here to do certain things to begin with. It's like they've never really been able to escape it. And instead it's like they were given the dominion they craved, and then they destroyed the earth,
Yep.
Kind of see that judgment as being a reflection. It's like, well, look at your fruits,
Well, and they even rebel against the gods in polytheist versions, right? So they look at themselves as physical
they want to
gods.
replace them too.
Yeah.
That's pure left-hand path.
Right. That's why you have these beings that are put into another abyss prison than where the fallen angels go, and that's how, through their belief system, these other ones escape from this counterfeit abyss right after the flood. And so these kings of destiny have the divine right to rule based on their genealogy and their linkage back to their gods who produced them. And so when you have, again, King James and the Stuarts with their divine right to rule, that's been the case right from the beginning, after the flood and before the flood. So they're just exercising their power on earth at the behest of the assembly of the gods, but there has been a few rebellions on that we saw, certainly at least before the flood.
Well, it's in their nature to rebel, even against their proud fairy.
Exactly.
And you mentioned how they would be replacing the offices that are now vacant. Well, and that angel that Jacob wrestled with, he was the chief musician, right? Because he had replaced Lucifer. So in this case, we see like he had already been replaced there. And then in Revelations, it says, I think we'll be replacing the other angels that have fell and be judging them, or something like that. So I thought that was really remarkable when you mentioned about the replacing of the guard, as it were.
Yep.
And that's what they want to intercede and interfere with, right? Because if they can corrupt our seed, we won't be able to inherit what that seed's been promised, right?
Yeah, but I would qualify that to a certain degree, is that up until the resurrection, they believed they could destroy humankind's ability to be raised up like angels and then to judge those angels, as we're taught in
it was
the
in
New
their
Testament.
best interest, yeah.
Yeah, but they didn't know, because God doesn't tell them everything. Again, as it's recorded in the New Testament, as we're talking about these details, is that, and this is in Corinthians, that if they had known about the resurrection, they would have ensured Jesus wasn't crucified, as opposed to orchestrating it.
That's
right?
the victory in the cross.
Yes, they didn't anticipate that. And that's why Jesus visits these fallen angels in the abyss and says, your rebellion's officially over when I rise on Sunday. And you're going to the lake of fire. It's done. So after that, they know it's all over. Even the angels outside of the abyss. But they continue to fight just to destroy as many as they could. But before that, their revenge was to destroy and obliterate humankind by leading them astray and into rebellion and into debauchery, so that none of them would be resurrected. But of course, they didn't understand. Well, they understood God was Alpha Omega, but they certainly didn't anticipate what God foresaw, because you could see every move that the angels were going to do and all of their followers, and that he had the resurrection Messiah becoming flesh plan in place right from the beginning.
It's so they're definitely not all knowing then. These spirits are prone to error, it seems.
it clearly says in Corinthians, where it talks about them not anticipating the resurrection, that God withholds knowledge from them.
Mystery is one of his attributes, it would seem. That's actually what I think the name of, in the Testament of Solomon, when he encounters those 7 sisters, the 7th one is unnamed. And I think that her name must have been Mystery. And his sin was in pursuing her, because curiosity killed the cat, as it were. There's just some things we're not supposed to know because we're not on that level, And I think that's why the angels got in trouble, was because you mentioned they were teaching illicit knowledge, for instance. And that some of this things from the realm of mystery. We're not supposed to know God in certain ways, and so that term "know" a lot of times carries like the copulation. It infers copulation, like with a spirit, and so it's very interesting how all this kind of interweaves. So we really have their fruits laying all about today, it seems. See if I had another note here. I wanted to
Hold on. Before you do,
yeah, sure.
Bubba missed.
I got one more.
Bubba missed the first time we asked this question, but you'll just have to go back. In fact, Bubba, I've asked 2 of your questions, so if you missed the answers, he said, "Are these guys going to answer my questions?" Yes, we are. They are answering. So Bubba's most recent question is, it's okay that they're a little off topic. Were the names in the Book of Life set in stone before the creation of the world, or are they added as we live out our free will?
Before the creation of the world, as the New Testament says.
Hey, Aaron. Somebody said there's like noise, but I don't hear anything.
Yeah, I hear one person saying they're hearing walking, cleaning, shuffling, dryer ringing, and if anyone else is hearing that, let me know. I haven't heard anybody say. I know the ringing is from I have a Mac now, so the ringing happens from the if I get a text. I don't know how to turn it off, so it's just a ding, but that's all it is. So that's not cleaning, shuffling, dryer ringing.
Okay.
And I don't
just making sure, because I know sometimes I can't hear everything that's on.
Well, I don't hear anything else. I do mute my headphones when you guys are talking, so I don't hear anything on your end. Somebody says yes in airplanes. Who knows? I haven't heard anything like that. I haven't had any airplanes coming over my house or anything, so that's very curious. No idea where it's coming from, guys, but I don't hear it coming from Gary, and I don't hear it coming from NPC, and I know I haven't had airplanes or dryers.
I try to mute when I type, so it might not always be muted.
Yeah.
So
I've not heard any of that noise, but you know what? They're always trying to tamper with things when we're talking about these things.
True.
So they're creating disturbance. The gremlins, absolutely. So, Baba, and if you wanted to know that verse where you can look it up, that's Revelation 13:8 on the Book of Life, and it says the name's not written in the Book of Life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, and the foundation of the world was laid before the creation of the earth.
Yeah, the foundation stone that became the head of the corner.
Yep.
The blueprint. It's like the prototype.
Yeah.
Oh, I had a.
My mic is muted.
So it could have happened here.
Yeah, I didn't hear it, but anyway, we don't know, guys. Sorry. But anyway, continue, NPC.
So I was going to ask about this concept that it does tie back to Ireland, but also other countries too. When we're talking about the eighth ruler, and I was just thinking about these trees and the fruits and the fullness of what they're trying to accomplish. And so it reminded me of this concept of the seventh son of a seventh son. Do you know anything about this? It's like something from folklore.
Well, there's a movie that was out on the seventh son of seventh son, and that was a very special individual, but it's kind of counterintuitive to the understanding of being a special king, because it's the firstborn king that is always the successor, not the seventh born. So I'm not quite sure what they're getting at with that terminology, but it was like a Messiah type of character that they were talking about in the movie, as I understood the allegory of the seventh son of the seventh son of the seventh son. So, and again, it's a prime number, and if you multiply that, you get 49, but I don't really get anything out of that number either. So, but I'm not an occult expert because I'm not part of the mysteries. So I can only deduce what I can deduce and learn what I can learn from the outside in. But it's an interesting term for sure. I've not cracked that one.
Yeah, it's really weird. It just talks about how this person would, be able to be clairvoyant and all this. And I don't know. I just wondered, since it was kind of a folk tale, you might have heard about it. But they're supposed to be able to be immune to snake venom and chant and recall snakes and all these weird serpent type things. So I thought maybe you'd ran across it.
Well, again, as you get down into the secondary siblings, right? They all of the siblings and everybody in the royal families and the bloodline families have a specific role and a function. But with what you're describing there, that's more of a priest-like function. And so that's not unusual to have those secondary siblings that are that are moving into, that far down the chain into the religious aspect, right? So that they're not in charge of the government, but they're looking after the religious aspect. And that's probably where that goes. And when you have that, immunity from the snakes, I don't know whether they're trying to overlay the seraphim incident in Numbers.
I like the brazen serpent.
Yeah, or they're bringing up maybe the Nahesh, the serpent that is an enchanter and has the knowledge of the occult, but it seems to be sort of connected into that kind of imagery. But again, as I said, I've not done a lot of research on that, and I've not been able to crack it. So,
and one other thing, we were talking earlier about some of these bloodlines that claim to have been born from what they considered gods, and one that came to mind was this Dis Pater, or DIS. I guess it's just it's like a Sabine god or some. It's like related to Rome and all this. So I figured that maybe some of them were coming from that too, like they're Gaulish and Germanic. It's like a god of thunder or something like that, and the underworld. So I just didn't know where these folks really came from, but they kind of connect to Hades and Persephone and things like that. So I was wondering if maybe you'd ever heard of this gang, or maybe which family they kind of connected to. The DIS. It says here Jupiter, which France is where the Gauls are, right? And I think Emmanuel Macron refers to himself as Jupiter. Yeah. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. So Pater, as opposed to Mater, this comes out of the Etruscan and Roman history. So Mater as in the mother goddess, Pater as in a father god. And Dispater, as it comes out of the Roman, typically refers to gods that are kings of the underworld. So like Hades would be one, right, that everybody would recognize. And so Dispater in the Roman pantheon is also the name of the god of the underworld. So typically it's those infernal underworld gods. So like maybe Mot in the Canaanite pantheon, is brother of Baal. So kind of look at it that way. And again, you can start to see you've got all of these other equivalent gods who are in charge of the underworld in all the other pantheons. So just different names.
Did they have to create their own? Is this why they created their own feast days and such? Was it part of the process of becoming possessed or inhabited by these spirits? Like, I was just wondering how that mechanic works. When they made statues of themselves and maybe declared feast days, it's like, was all that revolving around keeping their spirit alive or something, or feeding it somehow? I mean, it sounds like nonsense, but I'm wondering if there's actually something to it.
So feast days are, in honor of the specific god, right? Just as you have that tradition in the Catholic Church, as on St. Patrick, all the saints have a special feast day. So it's in honor of the god. And typically all of the gods required and demanded worship. Not just the parent god, but all the gods were worshipped. And so they would have their specific days of worship. And they would do that in the feast. And in the feasts, you would not only have hunts, as it's described, as we talked about earlier, and sacrifices in honor of the god. So when we talked about at St. Valentine's Day that they had at the Lupercal festival, they were honoring the goddess Lupercal, and I'm trying to remember the female one, but that was all in honor of that particular god and goddess. So that's why they have had the feast days, and that's why it's disturbing that you have saints that have feast days. That it's like kind of continuing in a way to raise this individual to godhood in the image and in the tradition and in the ritual of what was done for the gods of polytheism.
So it's like they're giving up, whether they realize it or not, like they're giving up a part of themselves so that the spirit can like maybe live in them, and or does it vicariously experience things through them? It just makes you wonder. But I could see why Yahweh destroyed all that, because that's basically what it seems like was going on.
Yeah, and then second to that, you would have the demigods. So the kings and the queens, they would take on, and you use your word vicariously, the imagery of a god, right? So that Nimrod, he's depicted as several different kinds of gods, like Tammuz, for example.
Oh, they'd steal from the other ones, huh?
Yeah, they would say vicariously, I am that god, and I am that representative. So again, the kingships were answerable to specific gods throughout the pantheon, depending on where their kingship fit in.
And they all seem to have boundaries to their realms too. Like in Ephesians, it talks about the principalities and wickedness in high places, but we know that there's dominions and such.
Yeah.
So whenever you mentioned Revelation 9 earlier, the king over them is, so maybe there's a king that's not here yet, but then when comes has a higher spiritual hierarchy, like you were mentioning seraphim and things earlier.
Yep.
So it'd be like he just outranks them, and you know, they have to kowtow to him, right?
Yes, and there's that hierarchy in that host, right? And it's like an army. So ultimately, and so if they come back, then they're going to want to take their original position. And if they held that position before, they were probably more powerful and will, actually be able to take that position again. And to the start of the question, you have the 70 nations on earth. So as that comes down on earth and as it affects the individual kings, and as I was matching up that, they would be honoring and reporting to specific gods within the hierarchy. Imagine the original 70 nations, and then as the population expands and as people migrate across the earth, those 70 nations will have, each of them, many other offspring nations that are, built in with a similar hierarchy that will ultimately go back to the 70 gods at the assembly, but they'll have specific let's say lower ranked angels of probably the same orders, because you'll have different orders in the hierarchy as you go all the way down to all of those expanded kingdoms. So if you can imagine the coat of arms, where you have a lot of similar coat of arms, and some of them have images that might cross over into representing other gods, that is showing where they fit in those expanded kingdoms and the gods that they would be worshiping and honoring.
Just like the animal kingdoms, as it were.
Yes, exactly.
That's why I think these, vaccines are so dangerous, is because they actually have multiple animal kingdoms in them. And I think that would be one way of really, trying to force God's hand, is by corrupting everybody's temple, with these various kingdoms, because it's one way for them to bridge the gap with the authority they lack, which I know it sounds conspiracy theories, but it makes sense to me.
Well, if anyone's wondering, I figured out the culprit of the background noise.
Oh,
Excellent.
So, we're new. I'm not more than one person, but I do have some people that do help me with this, and I am new at using this. And so, what my software does is it picks different. There's now 2 different microphones that are being picked up, which is why we had a massive echo in the beginning. And so another microphone was being picked up. So yeah, at one point I got up and I went and I poured some water. So that's probably what people heard was me shuffling to the sink and turning on the sink and the water because another microphone was completely picking it up, even though I had muted my headphones. Whatever. Anyway, apologies for that. We are at the 2-hour mark. Is NPC? I don't want you to miss any questions though. So if
I had
you've
one
got,
more.
yes, go for it. I don't want to miss any.
Well, it's from the chat too. So since they asked it, I'll
Yes,
ask this
please.
because I wanted to ask about the dolmens because you mentioned the portals, and so the question in the chat was about St. Patrick getting rid of all the portals in Ireland. Would those portals have been fairy mounds? Well, I've seen them, the giant mounds and fairy mounds and the dolmens all kind of associated with some type of travel. So yeah, can you talk about that any?
Well, one presumes yes. My research, it only has it really talking about the water portals, but if you're going to shut the portals off, you would have to shut off the fairy mounds and the fairy dolmens as well. So one presumes yes, that's what was going on. I wonder how he got to all of them to be able to do it, but I'm not here to substantiate the myth and just say, just say what the research
Probably
says.
with a, like a witching rod, how they find water. Maybe he had a
divining rod,
a tool.
portal divining rod. Yeah. So one would presume yes, if he was going to be successful, you would have to shut off all of the various portals. So,
and they used to put their seeds in them too. From what I can tell, some of the smaller ones, they'd have like a really large megalithic stone sitting on top of a few others, and then the pressure would create this piezoelectric frequency, and then they would put their seeds in that and bathe them in this energy for a while before they would do stuff with them, and they were supposed to grow better and whatnot.
Yeah, they're like a mini Stonehenge sort of look, right? You've got these large side rocks with a cap rock, and those rocks are supposed to emit energy of some sort, and they're usually on ley lines and things like that as you dig into the various aspects. So,
like the Great Pyramid is supposed to have that same effect too, I would assume, because it's all quartz.
Yep.
And they would have these sarcophagi that would be made of granite and then have these really heavy lids, and they would put oxen in them and just put the lid on, and I guess all that gas and everything would get trapped in there and create this vibration effect, and it's just wild stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like a dolmen then too, right? Because it has those shafts in it that go straight to the stars. So it's like their own stargates, I guess. Low tech, high tech.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
CERN's starting back up again, by the way, Gary.
Oh, right. Yeah, they are.
This spring. It's the Beam project.
Yep.
Sounds
that means.
Simple, right? The beam. I guess they're supposed to be blasting a beam into the center of the Milky Way. What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
It depends on if you believe in space the way that.
Well, yeah, but still, that's their intention, I guess.
Maybe the Milky Way is just an alternate dimension. Anyway, I know that you guys have the link to Gary Wayne's website. And if you want to buy a book directly through his website, he will sign it for you. They just need to email you. Is that right, Gary? Yep.
Email me through the website. It has to contact the author. Email is the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. That's the number 6. So Genesis 6 Conspiracy at gmail.com, or message me on Messenger. And if you're looking for the documents, I will send it to you. Also wanted just to throw a few couple points in about St. Patrick before we go, and it'll only take
Please. No,
a minute that we
take
never
your
got
time.
to. So, well, and we talked about a lot about what he did. We didn't talk about who he was. So he comes from a very wealthy family, but as an orphan. So he's of the bloodlines, just as in all religions, and particularly how it took over the Roman Catholicism. The bloodlines took over the leadership, which people know as the black nobility in Italy. But he's not Italian, but he is still part of the bloodlines and very, very wealthy. And where he becomes a bishop is he becomes a bishop at, I'll try not to butcher the word, Bishop of Auxerre, and that's the Auxxere in France. And he's mentored by the infamous Saint Germain, who seems to pop up through history, and why he has a lot of aspects of immortality to him, but that's another rabbit hole. And this is not just a regular place in France to become a bishop of. He actually is part of the Benedictine monks. And what's important about the Benedictine monks is that when you have the formation of the Knights Templar, you have two Cistercian monks that are bloodlines that are also part of the founding, and that's the same monastic order as the Benedictine monks, just as Saint Benedict, who's the second most powerful individual at the time of the Templars, sponsors the Templars, writes the letter, and does the argument to get their papal bull to become an officially recognized monastic order within Catholicism. And monastic orders are typically ascetic Gnostic orders that mold into Catholicism through early builder guilds, and in particularly like the Augustine Cistercian Benedictines of England, which St. Patrick would have joined. And they built the churches not only in England, but through the collegia, and as the sort of inheritors of the collegia technology in Italy, they became Catholicism's builders all around the Roman Empire. And so as we look at how this interconnects with St. Patrick as being a Benedictine monk, and he is part of this order, this monastic order, and it's his mission to go to Ireland. And before I jump into what that eventually turns into, if you want to know where the monastic orders derive from, other than they start with the builder guilds at the rise of Christianity, and they do that to survive within Christianity. So the Manichaeans, the Mithrites, they all go underground, but mostly the Manichaeans go underground into these monastic orders within Catholicism. And before that, the model derives from the Essenes as the first monastic polytheist order in the West. And so they extend back to the east in terms of that monastic order. And of course, they're very, very much ascetic orders. So this is that organizational structure that also is part of what gets blended into the Masonic orders. And so that's why there's such a deep connection between these Gnostic moles, the bloodlines, and the secret societies, which has been there all throughout time. But what happens, as I talked about in terms of, as we referred to within the Arthurian stories, is that this is now no longer going to be the time of the Druids, as Merlin talked about. This is going to be the time of Christianity, and it's got to go underground. And so beginning in this period of time in St. Patrick and into the age of King Arthur is Celtic Druidism merges into this monastic Gnostic order and becomes adopted, funded, and overseen by the Gnostics within the church, and it's called Celtic Christianity, that is operating for the most part all of a significant percentage of the Christian evangelism and the Christian churches that come out of that thereafter. And they continue to be part of that internal Gnostic organization to this day.
Okay, so since there was a little bit of addition, NPC, did you come up with any questions based on that information?
No, not necessarily, but I did share as I was sharing the page for St. Patrick, like a wiki, the image of him here is him wearing green and red, holding a shamrock. I just thought it was funny because there he is.
And the red. And
And
holding
he's-
the shamrock.
And he's said to have died on the 17th of March.
Really?
So I just thought that was kind of interesting.
That's why they celebrate that particular day.
It's a pretty interesting character. Apostle of Ireland, he's known as.
Okay, well, anyway, there's so much, but what I love is it is all related and it is all connected. And when you buy the book, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy from Gary Wayne's website, which is pinned at the top and also in the description box, you can get it signed by him, as he said, and you can message him through the website, or you can email at genesis6conspiracy@gmail.com. And if I said anything wrong there, Gary, you can correct me. And also they can find you on Facebook and message you there, correct?
Correct.
All right. So with that, if anyone doesn't have anything else, I'll just close with a prayer and let you all go. What do you say?
Meow, meow.
Meow, meow. All right. Well, I just want to pray with you guys real quick before we all hang up and go on with the rest of our night and enjoy the peace and quiet, or hopefully peace and quiet, of the kingdom of heaven on earth. So, Abba Father, we thank you. I especially thank you for people like Gary. I really am so grateful for my community. These are people that come out, they have things going on in their lives. They have family, children, friends, households, and they take the time to come and hear what we have to say, and mostly Gary. But thank you so much that they do that. Thank you so much that people take the time to come here and be a part of this community. And we are so grateful for you first, that you brought us all together, that without you, there would be no community. There would be no ability to understand truth. And it is because of you that Gary has the brain that he has, that NPC has the brain that he has, and that I have the brain that I have. And I'm hoping we'll continue to come together to teach people the truth in the mighty name of Yeshua HaMashiach. And we love you and we praise your holy name. It is worthy to be praised. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Thanks for being here, guys. So until next time, have a blessed night, and we'll see you maybe in a month or two.
Shabbat Shalom. And we'll be meeting next Friday for the 26th?
I believe so. Yep.
Yeah, we'll be talking about Passover.
Yep, Passover next week, so don't miss that. And Gary, thanks so much for being here again. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was hopefully it was a entertaining discussion for the audience. I know I certainly enjoyed myself tonight.
I enjoy it.
Yeah.
Well, good. As long as you guys are enjoying it, then I know the audience is enjoying it, because that's how it works. And also, every time I hear you talk about things, it starts to click more and more for me. So maybe one of these days I'll be as scholarly as you. I don't know. I'm not gonna bet any money on it though. So.
Gary, are you writing any other books, by the way? Do you have any others maybe on the horizon?
Yeah, I started a book on end time prophecy in the second Exodus, but I've been pushing that one uphill. So
Oh wow.
I've been so I've started another one, and it's coming along nicely, and I want to have it done this year. So it's going to be a sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy, and then hopefully I can go back and finish the other one. But seemingly this one is the one I'm supposed to be writing right now. So
maybe you're supposed to finish after it happens.
maybe.
Oh, and that's interesting, Gary, because I won't keep you long. I just want to say I've come up with times like that where something, I'm just hitting a wall and I want to do it. It is something I feel like I want to do, but I have to let it go for a while, and something else just flows, and then I know it's the Lord's timing. So good for you.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Okay, guys, I'm going to let you go. Have a super, super blessed night, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all for your time. Farewell.
Good night.
So the one thing I can tell you is they're not going to be like us. These things that we're building are not going to be people. And these things that we're summoning into the world now are not demons, but they're not good, they're not evil. The same way that you don't care about an ant is the same way they're not going to care about you. There are entities that are not going to be aligned with what we want.
There's a plan and a scheme to merge man with machines, to reprogram our genes, to replace human beings with something obscene, a transhuman dream, a self-aware robot that can't be redeemed, a puppet on strings with programmable brains, a mixture of iron and clay in its veins, the Lego Man seed with nanotechnologies and demo the mark of the beast artificially, bypass the boundaries of death and biology, instantly stop all decay, reverse entropy, quantum computer control powered memories, customized bionic babies in factories, born with androgynous genderless pedigrees, grown with no souls, without an identity, molded identically, all grown synthetically, alchemically, merging their minds with technology, entranced and enthralled, a chance to evolve, a trance that has captured, enchanted them all, a plan that involves transcending the fall, transhumanist movement, translucent cabal, entranced and enthralled, a chance to evolve, a trance that has captured, enchanted them all, a plan that involves transcending the fall, transhumanist movement, translucent cabal, like a morbid assortment of Frankenstein forces, control rigor mortis and zombified corpses, distortions like hybridized flesh-covered cyborgs, assortments of warlocks and sorcerers, shaman imposters who summon up automaton monsters, homunculus minions, mechanical demons long ago are their wands in the rattles and chants, or their voodoo like trances and drumming and dancing, advanced are the hijinks and latest contraptions, with gadgets and gizmos to seek their distractions, adapting to tap into unmapped dimensions, to overlap quantum and tangled connections, bizarre spooky action control from a distance, like visitors come to assist us, there is no resistance and no one's suspicious, they're wicked and twisted, magicians in their mission is endless, entranced and enthralled, a chance to evolve, a trance that has captured, enchanted them all, a plan that involves transcending the fall, transhumanist movement, translucent cabal, entranced and enthralled, a chance to evolve, a trance that has captured, enchanted them all, a plan that involves transcending the fall, transhumanist movement, translucent cabal.
This transition is really, really massively important for our entire species to navigate, and nobody is paying attention. This thing is happening in the background, and underneath it all is this rising tsunami that, if we're not careful, is going to wipe us all out. Is this rising tsunami that, if we're not careful, is going to wipe us all out.